Hey everybody, this is a piece by Samuel Knafo. It's titled Political Marxism and Value Theory, Bridging the Gap Between Theory and History. This was originally in Historical Materialism 15, published in 2007. I'm going to read the abstract first. This article proposes a reading of value theory firmly entrenched in the historicist framework of political Marxism, one which gives precedence to social relations and historical development over abstract logic and formal models. It argues that Marxist theory of value can be read as elucidating how social norms are being unwittingly created under capitalism by contrast with pre-capitalist societies. The article is divided into two sections. The first examines the two main ways in which value is considered within Marxism and highlights the problems that can emerge when taking into account the issue of the specificity of capitalism. The second section offers an alternative formulation of value theory grounded in the notion of alienation. This leads to the conclusion that the idea that value is shaped by labor refers to a political fact about decisions concerning the organization of the labor process, rather than an economic fact about the expenditure of labor in the process of production. Value reflects the class struggles over the labor process and the norms that govern social life, rather than an embedded quantity of socially necessary labor time expended within the labor process. That's the end of the abstract. Introduction. One of the central criticisms addressed to political Marxists such as Robert Brenner and Ellen Wood has been the absence of the labor theory of value in their work. This has been taken to represent a weakness because the fundamental conflict between labor and capital only emerges, it is said, through an analysis of value theory. Echoing a pervasive sentiment among Marxists, Fine, Lapavitsas, and Milanakis argue that, quote, without an appropriate value theory, the veiled nature of the capital-labor relation could not be laid bare, and the basis for inter-capitalist competition, a factor so strongly emphasized by Brenner in his latest work, cannot be revealed, end quote. For this reason, it has been fashionable to discard political Marxism, particularly Brenner's work, for being, quote, Smithian, end quote, in its emphasis on surface dynamics that miss the internal workings of capitalism. Footnote. This is a general theme that runs through the various critics of Brenner published in two special issues of Historical Materialism devoted to Brenner's arguments on the long downturn of the post-war period. One can find clear formulations of this point in Leibowitz, 1999, and Bonefeld, 2000. End footnote. There is no doubt that political Marxists have been reluctant to refer to the labor theory of value. In many ways, the problem harks back to E.P. Thompson's ambivalence towards Capital, the book. An influential figure for political Marxists, Thompson argued that Capital represented a powerful critique of political economy, but a critique which was enmeshed within the framework it wished to criticize. Although useful to point to the limits of political economy, it could not therefore serve as a foundation for historical materialism. Quote, Capital was not an exercise of a different order than to that of mature bourgeois political economy, but a total confrontation within that order. As such, it is both the highest achievement of, quote, political economy, end quote, and signals the need for its supersession by historical materialism. To say the former is not to diminish Marx's achievement, for it is only in the light of that achievement that we are able to make this judgment. But the achievement does not produce historical materialism, it provides the preconditions for its production, end quote. E.P. Thompson. While political Marxists might not necessarily share such a view, Their relative silence on this question speaks of a malaise on their part regarding the place value theory should occupy in Marxism. In a way, their reluctance can be taken as a symptom of the difficulty there is in articulating a discussion of the logic of capital within a true historical materialist approach. Discussions about value theory tend to be abstract and ahistorical in nature. They often present themselves under the guise of a formal theory, identifying the inherent dynamic that value imprints on social processes. Marxists who follow this formal strategy generally seek to determine, in abstraction from history, the tendencies of capitalist societies, even when admitting that these tendencies can be somewhat countered. In deriving a principle of causality which can be isolated from the making of history, I argue, they make it difficult to bring history back in. Hence, it is frequent to see such theorists fetishize value as the bearer of a logic, an intrinsic mechanism of structuration, which can never, therefore, truly account for social agency and class struggle. Such an approach runs counter to the emphasis on history and social relations, which is the main concern of political Marxists. As Thompson pointed out, the idea that there are laws of motion in capitalism that can be formalized as a logic of capital is antithetical to the attempt to historicize social developments within the framework of historical materialism. As I would point out, theories based on the logic of capital have two important limitations which conflict with the preoccupations of political Marxists. First, they fail to specify what are the distinctive features of capitalism and rely on aspects of the market that are not specific to capitalism in their discussion of value. Second, their depiction of the logic of value as a single logic that applies to every capitalist society makes them unable to truly account for social changes within capitalism. The purpose of this article is to propose a reading of value theory firmly rooted in the historicist framework of political Marxism, one which gives precedence to social relations and historical development. Value theory is used here as a means of specifying the significance of historical developments, not as a principle of causality that would be said to operate in all capitalist societies. The article is divided into two sections. First, I address two questions central to value theory. One, quote, is value a product of labor, end quote. And two, quote, can value be considered an abstract representation of labor, end quote. As I will point out, in both cases, Marxists have had difficulty in identifying a concrete historical mechanism whereby value is determined socially, thus making it difficult to relate labor theory to history. It is this problem, I point out, that explains the difficulty for political Marxists of incorporating current labor theories of value within their own analysis. Second, I offer an alternative formulation of value theory which is more attuned to the concerns of historical materialism. The concept of value proposed here is firmly rooted in a notion of alienation, which is, I argue, crucial for historicizing capitalism. I conclude that the idea that value is shaped by labor refers to a, quote, political, end quote, fact about social struggles around the organization of the labor process, rather than a, quote, economic, end quote, fact about the expenditure of labor within the process of production. It reflects the class struggles over the labor process and the norms that govern social life, rather than a quantity of socially necessary labor time expended within the labor process. Section 1. Marxist approaches to the labor theory of value. As an entry point to the question of value, it is worthwhile raising a fundamental ambiguity surrounding the concept of value, which exemplifies the challenge involved in thinking about value theory. It is, indeed, intriguing to observe how value has come to refer to two supposedly opposite things. In its sociological sense, the term is used to refer to the social principles that guide people's behavior in a given society. Here, it constitutes a qualitative and normative notion that defines what a society deems acceptable or preferable. By contrast, value in its economic sense is likened to a quantitative and abstract measure that is attributable to commodities. Interestingly, both forms of value are often held to be incompatible, economic value being said to display its abstract feature only when it is disembedded from social norms. Economic value would thus only become central in societies where markets are no longer encumbered by social institutions. It is this assumption which has reinforced the idea that economic rationality, based on the pursuit of profit, can only fully operate if social values are dissolved, if, in other words, the market is disembedded. Polanyi. This distinction is central to the development of economics, whose purpose it is to deduce the abstract laws of motion of markets. As a formal endeavor, economics rests on two necessary assumptions. First, if economists wish to justify their objective of drawing out the abstract laws that govern markets in abstraction of history, they must posit that concrete social norms are secondary or unimportant for understanding how markets operate. Second, this formal perspective can only hold if economists imbue markets with a seemingly objective logic that transcends the agency of people involved in the economy. By separating the working of the economy from other social dynamics, economists thus reinforce the dualism between the economic and the social. Said to operate efficiently only in the absence of any other social considerations, markets often appear here as neutral environments because they seem to have no social foundations. It was Marx's achievement to see a broader social question in the problematic of value. His intuition was that value formation concerns not only the mechanism of wealth creation, but the process by which social norms are defined and instituted in a market society that seems to function without them. Whereas economists presented the market as a non-normative arena with natural mechanisms of regulation, Marx insisted that market societies produce social norms just as any other society. But they produce social norms in a more convoluted and indirect way. In pre-capitalist societies, social norms are mostly established through traditions or by decisions of social and political authorities. By contrast, norms in market societies are not directly or consciously instituted as such. They emerge directly with the generalization of practices when market pressures compel people to adopt strategies developed by others in order to remain competitive. Under capitalism, norms thus often emerge as accepted or popular strategies for competing on markets, and more specifically for producing more, quote, efficiently, end quote. Taylorism or, quote, just-in-time, end quote, production represent examples of such norms entrenching themselves into specific economic sectors or societies at different historical conjunctures. Marx's theory of value thus problematized the way in which markets enforce norms of social production and social life without appearing to do so. More specifically, it showed why social norms around production became so important under capitalism, and why they started to transform themselves more and more rapidly. There is, however, an ambiguity in Capital, the book, stemming from the fact that it appears to examine value from an economic and social perspective at the same time. Marx never clearly positioned himself on the relation between the economic production of value, logic of capital, and the struggles around social norms, class struggle. When reading Capital, one can thus have the distinct impression that Marx presents, at the same time, a theory of the production of value and a theory of the social form of capitalist societies. He uses the first to illustrate how labor is exploited, and the second to specify the nature of alienation under capitalism. Marx never clarified, however, how these two issues could be articulated to one another. Marxists often still hold on to both aspects of the theory, switching from one problematic to the other, depending on the argument they wish to make. Interestingly, it is arguable that this dualism has manifested itself in the growing divergence within Marxism between two readings of value theory that have moved away from one another since the late 1970s. This divergence was partly triggered by the critique leveled by neoclassical economists and post-Keynesians at the labor theory of value, such as Samuelson, Steedman, and Nitzan. At stake was the alleged inability of Marxists to point to a concrete and explicit link, i.e. value, between concrete labor and prices. In the absence of such connection, critics argue that the theory is nothing more than an unnecessary detour. As Joan Robinson put it, quote, "The whole argument is condemned to circularity from birth, because the values which were to be, quote, transformed into prices, end quote, are arrived at in the first instance by transforming prices into values, end quote." To say that value represents something distinct from prices, she argued, is an arbitrary assumption which cannot be proven because value does not manifest itself outside of prices. As Marxists were pushed to specify the nature of their position, they often started focusing on either the economic or the social aspects of value theory. The question of the, quote, production of value, end quote, became mainly associated with the work of Marxist economists, sometimes presented in the literature as, quote, fundamentalists, end quote, and with the attempt to develop an alternative economic framework based on value rather than prices. For example, Smith and Clark. The social form of value was often linked to value form approaches, sometimes labeled, quote, orthodox, end quote, theories, which emphasized the social effects of valuation on labor and considered value as a form that shapes social life. Each of these angles on the question of value suggested different responses to critics of value theory. Yet, in both cases, as I will argue, no satisfactory answer was offered to show how labor was concretely linked to value, thus making the relationship between theory and history ambiguous. The economic problematic of value. Value as the product of labor. The idea that value is a product of labor remains a central claim within Marxism. However, what this idea concretely means remains surprisingly ambiguous. Marxist scholars now generally agree that value is not a natural product of labor, labor that would be congealed in a commodity, but that it only emerges with capitalism as socially necessary labor time. What remains to be clarified, though, is how a quantity of social labor time can be attributed to a commodity, or, more concretely, through what process can socially necessary labor time be measured. It is arguable that Marxists mostly avoided the question during the debates over the labor theory of value in the 1970s and 1980s. Their response to critics generally consisted in either solving the transformation problem, such as Sheikh 1981, Sakine 1984, Lipitz 1985, Carcetti 1993, Carcetti and Freeman 1996, or in denying altogether the need to prove the existence of value in the first place, such as Pilling 1972. While these responses demonstrated that the labor theory of value could be perfectly coherent, they never showed how this value was concretely and socially determined. As a result, they left the question of the relationship between concrete labor and value as something relatively vague. To grasp the nature of the problem, we can start with one traditional explanation of why labor determines value. In an illustrative formulation, Murray Smith argues that, quote, "It is precisely because exchange affects a process of equalization of products of labor on the market that is involves a real abstraction, that production oriented towards exchange must take account of the fact that, quote, physiological labor, end quote, is both utility shaping and value creating. That is, both concrete and abstract at one and the same time," end quote. This has been a classic argument among Marxists. The key here is the reliance of Smith, as many others, on characteristics of the commodity in order to explain the nature of labor under capitalism. In this case, the commodity, or commodity exchange, is seen as leading societies to value in terms of abstract labor. In short, the argument goes, when products are compared on the market through a single quantitative scale, prices, then labor is considered in abstract and quantitative terms, that is, in terms of labor time. However, the assumption that it is the production of commodities that leads to the emergence of abstract labor and value as a, quote, product, end quote, of labor raises important problems. While it is true that the product of labor represents itself under a single abstract form on the market, prices, it is by no means clear why and how labor would be equalized in its products. In other words, products can have prices that make them commensurable on a single quantitative scale. But this does not show that these prices reflect a single property common to these products, and even less so that this property is labor time. While markets transform the way labor is socially considered, this is not sufficient to show why value is actually produced by labor. The issue here becomes clear when time comes to identify a concrete process that can explain how products could be valued according to labor time. Where do we find the proof that there is a concrete link between labor and prices? This cannot be taken for granted since, as Marx says, quote, value, ... does not have its description branded on its forehead. Value rather transforms every product of labor into a social hieroglyphic, end quote, Marx. This central problem is too often ignored by Marxists who simply assume that, in one way or another, capitalist societies compute and allocate value according to the labor that has been expended in a society. But one would be hard-pressed to provide any concrete evidence for how this occurs. How do people account for the labor time that goes into one labor process, or the total labor time expended in a whole society? Capitalists, for example, never establish prices for the commodities directly according to labor time. Similarly, consumers do not judge the value of a product according to the labor time they think is required for producing these commodities. Most of the time, people have little clue of the time that is involved. Hence, even if we assume that this is done unconsciously through the working of the system, it certainly has to be demonstrated how a society can account for labor time. Without any instrument responsible for such valuation, and without a deliberate choice on the part of consumers or capitalists to do so, what concrete mechanism can value commodities according to labor time without anyone being aware of it? The absence of any discernible mechanism which could account for labor time raises more fundamentally the issue of whether labor does actually produce value. Before directly addressing this question, it is helpful to follow a small thought experiment. Let us imagine a society where there is a high number of competitive capitalists producing the same commodity. Let us posit further that they all possess exactly the same composition of capital and are equally productive. In other words, they have the same production costs for the same output. In such a context, capitalists would progressively lower the price of their commodities to face the pressure of competition. Ultimately, prices would be lowered to the point at which they would simply cover costs of production, or even drop below them as capitalists try to outbid their competition. The result would be that no capitalist would be able to make any profit. Now, let us add that labor resistance is almost non-existent, and that capitalists do not improve their productivity. We could then imagine that capitalists would tend to extend the working day, say from 10 to 14 hours, in order to face competition. If all capitalists do the same thing, costs of production will still be the same for every capitalist, and prices would again be driven down by competition to the level of production costs. The counterintuitive result would again be an inability to make any profit, despite the dramatic increase in the working day. Can we accept then that no surplus value has been created despite the increase in the working day? Although such a situation may be unsustainable, the important point this example suggests is that capitalists will restore profit margins only if they manage to do something other capitalists cannot do. For example, reduce costs of production in a more efficient way than other capitalists. If costs remain equal for all and competition remains fierce, no one will be able to make profits. As I will argue later, it is this ability to differentiate themselves from other capitalists that matters here. For this reason, competition is crucial to the way capitalists fix prices, making it impossible to posit that value has any existence before circulation. More importantly, this example suggests, in a way, that labor in itself does not produce value. As I will argue, the notion that value is produced is somewhat misleading since it conveys the image of value as a product. Holding on to such a notion makes it almost impossible not to conflate valuation, i.e. the way we come to value things, with production and reduce valuation to production. Conflation between value and the actual commodity then becomes inevitable, leading us necessarily down the road of an embodied conception of abstract labor. Footnote: Anwar Sheikh's work represents a good example of the confusion that lurks behind this view of value as labor product. As adamant as he is to mark the separation between value and use value, he still argues in the last paragraph of his critique of Ricardians and form theorists, quote, "Consider a crisis which so little of the social product is sold that profit is actually negative. This is a recurrent real phenomenon in capitalism. Are we then to say that even though workers were exploited and a surplus product produced, surplus value is itself negative?" End quote, Sheikh. For Sheikh, of course, the response is that we cannot, but the confusion here is clear. Surplus value has nothing to do with the quantity of goods produced or with the labor expanded. I think it's supposed to be expended. Arguing that it does necessarily lead us down the path of a conception of embodied value. Arguing that it does necessarily lead us down the path of a conception of embodied labor. Rather, surplus value reflects a more complex fact about capitalist competition and the way capitalists empower themselves within this competition, as it will become clear later on. End footnote. This partly explains why Marxists who treat value as a quantum of labor time are often led down an ahistorical path in theorizing capitalism, which is at odds with political Marxism. Indeed, when treating value as another scale of economic value that exists behind prices. They must adopt a problematic strategy in order to solve a problem they themselves have created. To derive a new quantitative variable that is not observable, value, they need to isolate value formation from the social process they wish to explain, class struggle, alienation, etc., because these processes blur the attempt to measure value according to labor time. Footnote. This subjective kernel in the process of value formation poses important challenges for all economic theories of value. Indeed, in their search for an objective theory of value which can transcend the specific actions of individuals, economists must circumvent this subjective moment. This leads to causal explanations which, when they do introduce subjectivity, can only present subjectivity as a blurring filter that might limit the ability of someone to move in the direction predicted by the theory. In this sense, subjectivity is always presented as an impediment to the pure functioning of the process of valuation, rather than as something constitutive of it. End footnote. Subjectivity and agency, both involved in these dynamics, are thus cast as external variable to the logic that is being studied because they are necessarily incompatible with the formal procedures employed. This partly explains why Marxists working on this basis can take capitalist social relations as permissive conditions for the logic of value to operate, but cannot include them in their analysis of valuation. These two elements of the labor theory of value are indeed ultimately incompatible, because it is impossible to derive both a quantitative content, prices, and a qualitative form, social relations, at the same time from the theory of value. If one wishes to derive value as a quantity of abstract labor, it is necessary to abstract from all aspects of social life that create uncertainty in the analysis. The construction and evolution of social relations must thus be discarded when determining this quantitative value, because of their qualitative nature. By contrast, when we bring these latter aspects in, we blur the quantitative argument, ultimately dissolving it. Each, quote, issue, end quote, thus remains somewhat at odds with the other, creating an effect of uncertainty. The more we try to concretize how value is produced, the less we seem to have to say about the social form that value imprints on society. The more we define the effects of value formation on labor and social life, the less we seem able to concretely address how value is determined. As a result, it is impossible to factor the qualitative aspects of class struggle into the equation when discussing the logic of capital, which then necessarily leads to an analysis conducted in abstraction from historical considerations. Footnote. This problem is particularly salient in Marxist economics. Indeed, having to work from quantitative variables, Marxist economists need to factor into their theorization given quantities of labor time, otherwise they cannot put into motion the logic they wish to analyze. This is why Carcetti, for example, insists that, quote, abstract labor must manifest itself as social value, as value quantitatively transformed, at the moment of exchange, but it already exists at the level of production, end quote. My emphasis. Without the assumption of an initial production of value by labor, there could be no Marxist economics as we know it. The social problematic of value. Value as a form. If there is a link between labor and value, it must rest somewhere else than in the notion of value as a product of labor. A second way to address the question of value is to consider it as a social form that shapes the nature of society, particularly labor. Work on the value form has gained in popularity in the last decades as scholars increasingly moved away from the more, quote, economic, end quote, reading of value which dominated Marxism before the 1970s. Some of the notable exceptions of writing addressing the value form earlier are Rubin and Rozdalsky. Concretely, this has meant turning away from more quantitative questions regarding the formation of value and prices in order to focus more directly on qualitative issues revolving around the formation of value itself and its consequences on capitalist societies. For example, Elson, 1979, Royton and Williams, 1989, Clark, 1991. Work on the value form has thus been interested in examining how abstract labor emerges and what the implications are that derive from the fact that labor is considered abstractly. Let us examine the first aspect of this problematic. The issue that interests me here is not simply to determine whether we can observe such a process of abstraction concretely operating, something I argued is doubtful, but, more fundamentally, whether it could be possible in the first place. Can labor itself be considered in abstract terms, or more specifically in terms of labor time? And is this really a specific feature that defines capitalism? I start here from a crucial point that Marx raises in Capital. As he points out, labor, under capitalism, acquires an unprecedented collective form, which makes it impossible to disaggregate its production into a series of individual contributors that would be, contributions that would be made by workers. Quote, just as the offensive power of a squadron of cavalry or the defensive power of an infantry regiment is essentially different from the sum of the offensive or defensive power of the individual soldiers taken separately, so the sum total of the mechanical forces exerted by isolated workers differs from the social force that is developed when many hands cooperate in the same undivided operation, such as raising a heavy weight, turning to a winch, or getting an obstacle out of the way. In such cases, the effect of the combined labor could either not be produced at all by isolated individual labor, or it could be produced only by great expenditure of time, on a very dwarf-like scale. Not only do we have here an increase in the productive power of the individual by means of cooperations, but the creation of a new productive power, which is intrinsically a collective one, end quote. Marx. Author's emphasis. This qualitative aspect of the labor process implies that there can be no determinate relationship between the individual inputs of workers, in terms of labor time, and the value attributed to a commodity. In other words, the output of a collective process of labor represents a productive power that can never be traced back to concrete labor time. that is, the actual hours put in by workers. This problem of translating quality, i.e., the organization of the labor process, into quantity, value/labor time, is a sizable obstacle for people who wish to defend the notion that value is an abstract representation of the concrete labor accomplished in a society. Footnote. This view is particularly prevalent among Hegelian Marxists who emphasize the dehumanizing aspect of capitalism. The problem with capitalism then becomes reification, understood in the terms of the reduction of labor to a mere object, such as Lukács. End footnote. Because the labor time actually invested by individual workers will result in varying outputs depending on how they are organized, it thus becomes difficult to think of value as a representation of labor. Footnote. Massimo De Angelis tries to circumvent this problem by inverting the chain of causality. De Angelis argues that it is because labor is abstract under capitalism that it must take the form of value. Citing Marx, De Angelis points out that abstract labor is, quote, human labor that is expended without regard to the form of its expenditure, end quote. The idea of abstraction is something that pertains to the struggle around work, rather than the way in which this work is translated into value, offers an original take on the question, but one that is, in this case, fundamentally problematic. Indeed, De Angelis only further fetishizes the idea of capitalism as a flattened society where difference in norms have no role to play. It is thus no coincidence if his discussion of class struggle is essentially limited to a, quote, quantitative, end quote, struggle over the length of the working day. By opposition, political Marxists focus on the qualitative dynamic of the class struggle under capitalism, which revolves, much more importantly, around the transformation of the labor process. End footnote. On what basis, then, can we assert that it is actually labor that is represented by value? What about socially necessary labor time? This expression has been popular because it suggests, in a way, that the process of valuation under capitalism somehow transcends this diversity in labor processes by ultimately comparing them according to their output for a given amount of labor time. Labor time could thus be averaged out, and thus abstracted, according to the necessary time required for producing a commodity in a society at a given point in time. This type of conception can accompany, for example, the argument that abstract labor emerges at the point of junction between production and circulation, and thus is not directly linked to concrete labor. In other words, the notion of socially necessary labor time is often taken as a means to avoid the problem evoked above. Footnote. Clark, 1981, end footnote. However, it is more a convenient assertion than a demonstrated fact, and begs the question more than it solves it. One might acknowledge that capitalist competition does indeed arbitrate between labor processes. But what does this competition really mean in relation to value as a form, or to abstract labor? To be more precise, how can capitalist competition average out labor time in terms of labor productivity, and thus determine socially necessary labor time? Again, it is crucial here to be concrete about this process. One can surmise that, if there is such an averaging out which balances out differences in labor productivity to arrive at a uniform scale of labor time, then it has to refer to one of two things. Either this refers to a process that averages out value according to labor productivity, meaning that the value of a commodity would be determined in relation to the productivity of all capitalists who produce it. Or, inversely, this can refer to a process that averages out labor productivity according to value. From this last perspective, we would assert that the divergence in productivity would tend to narrow down under the pressure of competition, thus leading to increasingly standardized forms of production. Let us examine each in turn, because they highlight the importance of a proper historical approach. In the first case, we are implying that the average labor time to produce a commodity serves as a standard for defining the value of all similar commodities. From this angle, socially necessary labor time plays a role in determining the value of a commodity. Obviously, one can conceive of calculating what is the socially necessary labor time required in a society to produce a commodity. Yet, one would have difficulty in showing how this is accounted for. More importantly, one must remember that this average can only be experienced as a determinate social force through competition. In other words, this average only concerns products that are competing in the same market. This is where the notion quickly starts to crumble, because a whole set of new social processes enter the picture to qualify the nature of this competition. To begin with, this average will vary depending on where one would wish to calculate it. Indeed, each location will have different sets of commodities competing against one another, meaning that the average will differ in each place it is calculated. Not only that, the quality of this access will also play a role. Hence, depending on strategies of product placement, on networks for distribution, and more broadly on marketing strategies, capitalists will experience this competition over productivity differently. This makes the idea of such an average highly hypothetical, if not dubious, especially if we are going to assume that this average has concrete social consequences. Ultimately, there seems to be no means to transcend the diversity that characterizes capitalist development. And this puts into question the idea that a common measure, or representation, of labor time could be arrived at in the first place. If we turn the problem around and posit that it is actually capitalists who adjust their methods of production in order to come closer to how other, more productive capitalists produce, the notion is also hard to uphold. In this perspective, we assume, in one way or another, that there is a gradual convergence in techniques of production which would make differences among labor processes less and less significant. The problem here is that capitalists react differently to competitive pressures. Facing capitalist competition, for example, can either mean moving towards extensive strategies of production, for example, relocating to areas where a cheaper labor force can be exploited, or towards intensive ones by improving productivity. Competition can thus generate a diversity in labor processes as much as it can contribute to convergence, making it difficult to posit that competition necessarily homogenizes labor productivity. I will, in fact, argue that methods of production tend to become increasingly diverse under capitalism. In highlighting these difficulties, I wish to stress how difficult it is to render concrete the notion of abstract labor. It is partly for this reason that work on abstract labor must remain highly abstract, formal, and divorced from history. Yet what interests me most here is the second aspect of the problematic of the value form. Indeed, according to form theories, the use of the concept of abstract labor hinges on whether the concept is useful for specifying the consequences of valuation on capitalist societies. One of the arguments that are generally evoked here is that under capitalism, consumers and capitalists consider labor only in abstract terms without taking into account the concrete conditions in which work is being done. For instance, McNally and Elson. In this way, market imperatives would push capitalists to constantly disregard the subjectivity of their workers, treating them as objects in the process of capital accumulation. Markets would thus subsume labor under a capitalist logic alien to its aspirations. For instance, Leibovitz, 1996, and Postone, 1996. This is clearly an important contribution of Marx. But just as the notion of labor producing value appears somewhat misleading, the same can be said about abstract labor. Indeed, we need to be careful not to equate the idea that labor is instrumentalized for the purpose of capitalist accumulation with the idea that labor is considered abstractly. Capitalists invest a great deal of energy into the hiring, the organization, and the supervision of labor. Differences among workers and in the way they work individually clearly matter to them. While certain social or moral values are definitely cast out of consideration by the need to remain competitive, capitalists still continue using social norms both for discriminating among workers and for managing the labor process. Footnote. Interestingly, Arthur himself is aware of this problem when he suggests that, quote, it is a mistake to identify the abstract labor that is the substance of value with the supposedly, quote, abstract character of the modern labor process in its physical form, end quote. The problem with Arthur's claims, however, is that he can only reconstruct a notion of abstract labor on the basis that there is such a thing as capital, a subject acting to self-reproduce, and in the process imposing its own logic against the will of labor. As soon as we break this fetishistic gaze which elevates capital as some sort of inherent force at work in capitalism, the idea of the indiscriminate nature of capitalist exploitation falls apart. From the perspective of individual capitalists, the concrete form of labor, its organization and management, is always of utmost importance, and in that sense, the concrete aspects of labor are a central component of what defines the capital-labor relation. End footnote. For this reason, the notion of abstract labor can appear inadequate to capture the consequences of valuation, because the notion of abstract labor suggests that social reality becomes reified and hollow, empty of social norms and values. As I will argue, the considerations that shape capitalist activity are never reducible to an abstract and undifferentiated notion, such as the indiscriminate exploitation of labor for accumulation. In fact, the main argument of this article is that capitalist valuation, far from leveling the field of society and stripping social norms away in order to lay bare a universal capitalist logic, has, in fact, intensified the importance of social norms. This is particularly the case for norms of production. Indeed, as Marx argued, the main specificity of capitalism is its incessant transformation of the labor process, which suggests a newfound importance for the qualitative features of labor under capitalism. In other words, the way people work now seems to matter more than its pre-capitalist societies. It is a curious paradox for value form approaches that the labor theory of value was developed precisely at a time when workers were assisted by means of production more than ever before in history, and that their work became increasingly specialized. Why, in a country experiencing an agrarian and then an industrial revolution, did political economists begin to think of labor time as the sole source of value? Footnote. Murray Smith discusses the related paradox that capitalists who use more machinery often make more profit. Having recast the problem of transformation as an issue of distribution, Marxist economists can state that, quote, the theory of value maintains that living labor is the sole source of new value, while empirical observation conclusively discloses that capital invested in dead labor, such as machinery and building structures, can establish the same rate of profit as capital invested in living labor, end quote. However, their formal solution poses important problems when the labor theory of value is set in context. How can we understand, for example, why political economists started talking about the centrality of labor at a time precisely when machines were becoming more important and made it more difficult to attribute value to its supposed, quote, true, end quote, source? If we agree with this argument, should it not be precisely at this time that people stop seeing labor as producing value? End footnote. Where am I? Should we not expect precisely the opposite? Indeed, if innovations become increasingly important to production, would labor not appear less and less as the crucial factor producing value? A more plausible hypothesis would be that the idea that labor was the main determinant in the process of valorization reflected the profound impression left on contemporaries by the newfound ability to systematically transform the labor process. This would have made, quote, labor, end quote, into something that increasingly needed to be conceptualized because it became a growing concern. Moreover, it was precisely qualitative differences in the labor process that struck theorists, not its growing homogeneity. Adam Smith, for example, famously marveled at the productive effects of the division of labor, which became a crucial notion buttressing his analysis of the market. This observation helps to explain why the notion of value introduced by British political economists represented such a breakthrough. Indeed, in dealing with the problem of diversity or of difference, the ingenuity of this solution was precisely to reduce quality into quantity by seeing the value of a commodity as, quote, equal to the quantity of labor which it enables, bracket, someone, end bracket, to purchase or command, end quote. Smith, Adam Smith. In this way, the concept of value represented a conceptual solution for apprehending an increasingly complex reality by positing a common denominator that could level this diversity. In other words, the development of value theory was precisely a means to abstract from important qualitative differences and to render commensurable the increasingly unequal development that accompanied the rise of capitalism. William Petty had initially introduced the concept of value in the late 17th century as a means for assessing lands with various degrees of improvement. Similarly, Ricardo later became the, quote, true founder of abstract political economy, end quote, by using the category of value in order to offer a measuring scale that, quote, scientifically, end quote, grounded discussions about distribution. His main contribution was precisely to level out the contributions or inputs of various social classes to the process of production by introducing a rigorous labor theory of value which made it possible to ground, quote, scientifically, end quote, his analysis of distribution. In stressing the lineage of this concept in the tradition of British political economy, it becomes easier to clarify what was Marx's contribution regarding value theory. As I will argue, it was the move away from this objectifying labor theory of value that distinguished Marx's conception of value. This move is too often obscured or neglected in contemporary debates on value, which often use value theory, just as British political economists did before them, in order to abstract from the complexity and diversity of social history. It is for this very reason that we need to be careful about the concept of abstract labor. Indeed, the assumption that valuation leads to abstract labor reinforces formal conceptions of value, which hinder our ability to understand how markets can value differently depending on their social context. If the abstract and impersonal features of market transactions are singled out as the determinant feature of capitalism, then one might presume that any market has an implicit capitalist logic. It is then impossible to define the specific nature of capitalism. As I argued in the previous section, the problem comes down again to the fact that Marxists too often take the fact that the product of labor appears in quantitative terms as proof that labor itself is the object of valorization. This, again, cannot be taken for granted. Even if people producing for markets are dependent on the realization of their products to reproduce themselves, this does not imply that the process of valorization will shape the nature of the labor process. Can't believe that last statement. In pre-capitalist markets, for example, profits often depended on political and military capabilities of merchants or on authorities that protected them because the main objective was to control trade routes. Hence, the restructuring of the labor process was not a central preoccupation because the influence of labor productivity was often secondary to price formation. In this context, the value of commodities had little impact on decisions regarding production, which were often regulated by corporate bodies, such as guilds, whose concerns were tied to ensuring certain standards of quality and to limiting competition, rather than focusing on increasing productivity. Arguments that try to further specify this form of value by arguing that it is the commodification of labor, which is the defining feature of capitalism, also fail to make a convincing case. Footnote. See, for example, Arthur 2002 for a discussion of the commodification of labor as the defining feature of capitalism. End footnote. This notion is often introduced somewhat arbitrarily to distinguish capitalism from previous societies with markets, but it suffers from two flaws. From a theoretical perspective, it is important to see that it is one thing to argue that labor can be bought and sold, and another thing to show that this fact makes value dependent on labor. What is never established is how wage labor can make a difference for the way people compete and suddenly make value dependent on labor. Why would labor time suddenly become a direct determinant of value with the emergence of wage labor? From a historical perspective, political Marxists have shown that introduction of wages did not lead to the type of transformation that we associate with capitalism. George Comnenel, in particular, has shown how the existence of wages in 18th century France was not accompanied by the profound changes in the organization of labor which so strikingly characterized England. In this way, drawing the links between history and theory remains a fundamental challenge. As I will point out, differences between markets did not boil down to the existence of barriers such as customary regulations, guilds, or non-wage labor, which would have stopped value from enforcing a capitalist logic. They refer, rather, to differences in the forms of power which open different types of strategies for dealing with competitive market pressures. Capitalism, for example, required a complex institutionalization of power, not a, quote, liberalization, end quote, of the market per se. As E.P. Thompson and others have shown, the construction of capitalist social relations required a protracted process of struggle through which all kinds of rules, regulations, and forms of discipline were established, slowly opening the way for the systematic transformation of the labor process that became the hallmark of capitalism. This institutionalization, of a distinctive form of social relation, what Brenner calls social property relations, provided different avenues for responding to the market imperative. The crucial point, then, is that these social relations do not derive from the market imperative in themselves, nor from the commodity form. It is, rather, the focus on the form of power which distinguishes Marx's conception of value, and which enables us to take into consideration the specific form of value under capitalism and the way it evolves within capitalism. Section 2. The origin and nature of value. I have argued that theories of value too often rely on formal features to establish the link between concrete labor and value. This ultimately makes it difficult to relate value theories to history, because these theories offer no adequate means for differentiating markets from capitalism. As a result, markets appear to impose similar imperatives, the difference being only the extent to which social institutions, such as feudal restraints, allow these imperatives to operate. Here, capitalism seems to emerge in the end when it is finally freed from the restraints of feudalism which would be impeding its quasi-natural growth. As Robert Brenner and Ellen Wood have shown, many societies have production geared towards markets, and thus use prices, even wage labor, without them being necessarily capitalist. Sorry, but I just don't think that's true. I mean, I don't know much about Robert Brenner, but in the case of Ellen Wood, she's definitely makes a distinction between it seems like she places heavy, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like she places heavy emphasis on production as such in general being geared towards markets and capitalism. It seems like there's a very much a distinctive difference within the political Marxist tradition between, casually buying and selling, and that being a generalized feature of production. Production being for markets, production being market dependent, is capitalist. But I mean, I'm not an expert. Obviously, there would be other things to consider besides just that, but I can't really think of a society where generalized commodity exchange prevailed that capitalism did not prevail. But I'm not sure. More problematically, these formal theories of value reinforce the dualism between social norms and market imperatives, leading us to an ahistorical view of capitalism as if it were a system which operated in abstraction of social norms. In the following sections, I outline a different approach to the value form in order to consider value as a socio-historical category that is constantly shaped by social relations. The distinction between value and price is justified here on the basis that value refers to the significance of social interactions around prices. In other words, it is not a theory about what value is. Otherwise, we would necessarily fall into a deterministic trap, but a discussion of how we should think about value in a given context. By this, I simply mean that a discussion of value pertains to the way we problematize market dynamics in order to capture the specific or socially constructed features of market competition and the way the market entrenches certain practices, turning them into social norms. One could thus say, from this perspective, that examining value is to problematize how social norms are sanctioned by commodity exchange. In making this point, I want to emphasize that value has nothing to do with a new quantitative measure that would be different from prices. To discuss value is to focus on qualitative features of society that are brought about by market competition. It should be further emphasized that the point here is not to identify social norms that characterize capitalism in itself, as if there was a logic that was common to all capitalist societies. On the contrary, I wish to highlight that, within capitalism, norms are still being constantly implemented and continue to evolve. Hence, if the historical test for any discussion of value rests on its ability to discern capitalist markets from non-capitalist markets, its usefulness should lay in its ability to further problematize the way norms are implemented within capitalism. The interest in Marx's theory of value as a tool for historicizing capitalism lies precisely in its ability to illuminate an aspect of social structuration under capitalism which is too often ignored because it occurs in a more informal way than in pre-capitalist societies. This will lead me to reconsider how value is linked to labor in capitalism, as Brenner argues. The crucial point here is that social norms become increasingly oriented towards social production and the restructuring of the labor process. More specifically, transformations in the nature of power have profoundly changed the way social classes compete among and within themselves. While exploitation has long been a crucial aspect of social empowerment, it is only in capitalism that the systematic restructuring of production becomes its dominant feature. I thus argue that it is the class struggle around this process of restructuration that constitutes the key to the process of valuation under capitalism. As I will point out, labor has a central influence on the determination of the value of commodities because of its agency in the transformation of the labor process, not because labor produces value in itself. Hence, whereas dominant views of value too often approach this question as an economic fact regarding production itself, it is argued here that this relationship can only be posited as a historical and political one. The centrality of labor in relation to value thus refers to the process of production and its political and conflicting nature, not to the expenditure of physical labor itself. It points to the specific form of social norms under capitalism and the way they are implemented through struggles around production. Alienation and the imperative of value. Before addressing the question of labor under capitalism, it is useful to reconsider what is the purpose of theorizing value. Marxist economists have traditionally justified the labor theory of value by referring to a social reality, value, which mainstream economists would be ignoring. The stumbling block with mainstream economic theories, from this perspective, is that mainstream economic theories take the wrong variable to explain economic behavior, prices instead of value, and thus miss the role of exploitation in the reproduction of capitalism. As I have argued, this type of critique contributes to reifying capitalism in its own way by positing that values of commodities are produced by labor. By contrast, I contend that value theory should be seen as a means for addressing the question of alienation in capitalism. Footnote. The notion of alienation used here derives from a Hegelian reading of Marx's notion of alienation and relates to consciousness. The foundation for this perspective on alienation are developed in Knafo 2002. End footnote. From this perspective, the real drawback with mainstream economics is its inability to account for the fact that the form through which people's needs and desires are expressed in capitalism is alienating. While people choose and decide what is socially valuable, partly on the basis of their own individual preferences, they never do so under the conditions of their own making because they do not understand the implications of their decisions. It is, thus, the problem of alienation which raises the need for a theory of value. What mainstream economists cannot explain are the social ramifications of people's economic decisions. In other words, they cannot grasp how people institute social norms without being aware of it. As I have explained elsewhere, the Hegelian problematic of alienation adopted by Marx is often misunderstood, partly because of the tendency of Marxists to emphasize objectification over fetishization. While objectification pertains to the process by which subjects are reduced to objects, the second refers to the way people fetishize objects, such as capital, thinking that they have a will of their own. Starting from this second approach, I am thus interested in the ways in which people disempower themselves in thinking that they are victims of transcendent forces, such as, quote, capital, end quote, rather than being the makers of their own history. Footnote. Too often, Marxists suggest that people are objectified, in the sense of being reduced to acting like objects deprived of their own free will. Even if prices shape people's decisions, this does not imply that people think in the same way. Indeed, people do different things when they think about value. Their rationality in thinking about value cannot be reduced to a single objectified form. Ultimately, the price they are ready to pay will always partially depend on their projects, desires, and tastes. In making this case for recognizing the importance of subjectivity in capitalism, my aim is not to defend the idea that subjectivity is or is not richer in capitalism, nor do I want to deny the existence of constraints on people. Their subjectivity, of course, is partly shaped by capitalism, notably by cultural industries, information, cinema, etc. Yet it is crucial to debunk theories that depend on the assumption that subjectivity does not play any role in capitalism. The challenge is precisely to understand how people create social imperatives even when they are not aware of it, and act according to their own, quote, own, end quote, subjectivity. Hence, the obvious point is that people do not all think in exactly the same way, and this implies that value is not based on a common understanding of what is valuable. The notion that labor shapes value has thus nothing to do in itself with the Smithian argument regarding what someone is willing to pay for a commodity according to how it has been produced. End footnote. This allows us to specify further the radical social bent given by Marx to Ricardo's theory of value. From this reading, Marx rejected the notion that capitalist dynamics are the product of the market itself, a notion that was at the heart of political economy and which became the foundation for economics. It is easy to get the impression, when looking at market dynamics, that it is the market itself that imposes the values and norms that regulate society in the form of competitive imperatives. However, even if people experience these imperatives as external constraints, this does not imply that market imperatives actually are defined by the market itself. The market only mediates social relations, but it is people who take decisions regarding the way they adapt to market imperatives, and their actions contribute in turning to shaping these imperatives. Fordism, for example, was the product of social innovations that were not inevitable. Once implemented, however, these innovations produced great pressure on competitors, obliging them to adapt, often by themselves adopting these new norms of production. It is thus impossible, as Marx makes clear, to focus on the market itself if one wishes to understand capitalism. The market, in itself, does not determine anything. It only translates social strategies into competitive imperatives, and thus contributes to normalizing certain of these strategies. For this reason, one needs to shift the emphasis from the study of the market as a structure to the study of the ways in which people relate to each other through this structure. This is why Marx insisted on the role of class struggle, and more specifically on social relations. Indeed, the mediation of social relations by the market, i.e., its structural condition, can only explain the particular form of class struggle in capitalism, but not its specific development or its results. Hence, moving beyond the fetishism of economics requires that we see discussions of value as a means for problematizing how struggles around social norms evolve under capitalism, rather than attributing to capitalism an inherent logic that always reproduces similar norms or effects. From this perspective, alienation no longer represents an explanation for why value exists, i.e., that labor is alienated in a way that only its labor time would matter. Rather, alienation constitutes the problem that value theory tries to address. This is why Marx starts from the question of fetishism in capital, since it sets out the terms of the problem. Valuation relates to the way people attribute meaning socially to things in quantitative terms, i.e., in the form of prices. The crucial point is that by doing so, they are also unconsciously validate social norms. Purchasing certain commodities can contribute, for example, to jeopardizing environmental laws if these commodities are produced in areas where capitalists can afford to disregard such laws, or invalidating a Fordist organization of the labor process if it makes commodities cheaper. On this basis, I argue that it is not value itself, as a product, that matters, but the consequences of what people do while valuing commodities. The decisions they make about what social norms we should value as a society without being aware of it. Such a standpoint helps us to move away from the whole problematic of what prices represent. A price has little significance on its own. It is only meaningful in the way it differs from other prices and allows us to compare products. Hence, valuation should not be considered as a process by which we abstract socially from concrete labor some kind of quantitative value, labor time. When people value commodities, they do not determine, for example, how much labor time is contained in them. Rather, in comparing prices, they unwittingly choose among norms of production and circulation, comparing them through prices. In this way, social norms remain important under capitalism, but they are now validated through market dynamics and are partly assessed according to the way these norms influence prices. This leads us to a preliminary conclusion that, through valuation, subjective decisions unwittingly create imperatives because they tend to create a social pressure. Alienation thus refers here to the fact that people are not aware of the way in which they shape their own society through their actions on the market. Value theory sets out the framework for problematizing market dynamics and bridging this gap between people's conscious understanding of their actions and their social significance, i.e., the social and unintended implications of their individual pursuits. As people tend to discriminate among different commodities by favoring less expensive ones, consumers unwittingly create an imperative for merchants and producers to reduce their prices. The need to be competitive in terms of prices represents a social imperative and establishes the conditions that participants in the market must meet to be socially validated. However, this imperative in itself does not determine how it is met and thus cannot explain in itself the emphasis on production that characterizes capitalism. What it tells us, however, is that market participants need to distinguish themselves from others in a way that is significant for the way people compare them to one another, i.e., through prices. This has historically been achieved in different ways, and only under capitalism is this link between valuation and production central. Indeed, it is in this context that the labor process turns into a central preoccupation for merchants and producers in their competition with one another. Value and the specific form of capitalist competition. The different angle for theorizing value, one which focuses on the ways in which people compete with one another by trying to demarcate themselves in a, quote, significant, end quote, way, in significant, end quote, significant, end quote, ways for the market, suggests a second conclusion. It is not the process of production in itself that determines valuation, but the strategies of capitalists for competing against one another. Footnote. Many Marxists reject the idea of starting from competition to discuss phenomenon related to capitalism. To do so, they argue, is to invert cause and effect in capitalism. Competition, they say, is only the outward manifestation of inward tendencies. This seems in line with Marx's oft-cited quote that, quote, competition executes the inner laws of capital, makes them compulsory laws towards the individual capital, but it does not invent them, it realizes them, end quote. Marx. It would be problematic, however, to interpret this to mean that competition, quote, only executes the inner laws of capital, end quote, in the sense that it simply produces what is given elsewhere. The problem is not that competition cannot be a starting point, but that we cannot consider competition a sufficient explanation as liberals do. Competition does not explain much in itself. Competition requires an analysis of its social form to understand what shape it takes according to the social relations which define social interests. In other words, competition is crucial to the dynamic of capitalism, but it remains unspecified in liberal theories. End footnote. This can be seen from the fact that competition has a direct impact on valuation, because competition shapes how capitalists establish prices. While interested in charging the highest price capitalists can, capitalists must nonetheless take into consideration both market demand and the prices of their competitors. From this perspective, one can thus argue that the process of valuation is shaped by the ability of capitalists to increase their room for maneuver in order to mark up their prices. The greater the difference between a capitalist's cost of production and the average price for the commodity produced, the greater is this margin. For this reason, competing under capitalism often involves lowering cost in relation to average cost in order to increase one's ability to mark up prices above productive costs. This idea of markup has been reviled by Marxists and associated with mainstream economics. This idea of markup has been reviled by Marxists and associated with mainstream economics, partly because it seems to question the fact that labor produces value. For these critics, the notion of markup focuses on individual capitalist strategies and neglects the social and collective nature of production. I don't know who this guy is talking about. Does he not think that value form theorists or even classical theorists of value think that individual capitalists aren't constantly trying to get surplus profits by improving the productivity or reducing costs of their production process? They clearly think that. And they clearly know that the imperative for that comes from the marketized society, the competitive market society in which they're swimming. Sorry, I'm going off my own thing. You don't want to hear me talk. But we should be careful not to dismiss this notion too quickly, since arguably marking up is a practice that can clearly be observed. When capitalists set up their prices, their main concern is the profit they receive, not the amount of labor time involved in the commodity. Hence, if there is a problem with this economistic notion, it has more to do with the absence of reflection on the specific social conditions which shape how individuals can mark up, not in the notion of markup itself. What, then, distinguishes capitalism from other forms of market competition? The issue here is to determine how people try to differentiate themselves from their competitors in order to mark up their prices. In pre-capitalist markets, the capacity to mark up often depended on political limitations. For example, the control of trade routes, official prices, which opened the possibility for arbitrages between different markets. If you don't want to know what an arbitrage is, it's like a so-called profit on alienation. So that means, for instance, you buy something one place and you sell it at a markup at another place. So you buy, something cheap in the Philippines or somewhere like that, and then you bring it to the United States and you sell it for a huge profit, just exploiting the space that exists between different markets or different locales. These opportunities, however, are reduced in capitalism through the liberalization and consolidation of broader markets. More importantly, political Marxists have alluded to three important transformations in the nature of power in England, which provided distinctive opportunities for people to face market imperatives. First, there was the constitution of a working class that could only appropriate its means of subsistence through the market instead of its own land. This created a compulsion to enter the labor market and work for owners of means of production. Secondly, the allocation of means of production evolved so that it was increasingly appropriated through the market instead of through tradition, hereditary lines, or political lines, as was the case in pre-capitalist societies. This obliged capitalists to compete on the market, most notably by reducing their costs of production and prices in order to generate the money to pay for means of production. Finally, the breakdown of customary rights and other, quote, social regulations, end quote, such as the ones enacted by guilds, and the institutionalization of an absolute conception of property, proved a crucial development giving rise to a new form of power. This provided capitalist producers with the power to restructure the labor process as they saw fit, imbuing them with the right to define the ways in which their property would be used without regards for customary usages. These specific historical features set the conditions for production to move to the center of social preoccupations and become the crucial means for creating a competitive margin for marking up. As capitalists began to exploit these new social property relations, prices became increasingly responsive to changes in production, pushing productivity to the heart of capitalist competition. Reducing production costs in relation to other producers thus became a central motive for capitalists to increase their margins of profit while remaining competitive. This in turn intensified the imperatives for other capitalists to do the same. This leads us to the question of labor, since the organization of the labor process, in this context, becomes the dominant strategy to demarcate oneself from other capitalists. The crucial contribution of Marx here was to show how decisions over the restructuration of the labor process are not simply individual, that is, dependent on the ideas of capitalists, but are social and political. Indeed, the decisions to extend and intensify the labor process have important effects on labor which are generally detrimental to workers. This is why the resistance of labor to the extension of the working day or the reorganization of the labor process constitutes a crucial factor in capitalism. It determines the differential capacity of capitalists to compete. The resistance of workers poses limits to the extension and intensification of the labor process, and continually has an impact on the transformations of social life which are wrought by capitalist forms of competition. Hence, Marx is able to show, contrarily to classical political economists, that the formation of value does not simply depend on the ingenuity of capitalists, but much more importantly on the relation of power that opposes them to labor. If surplus value emerges from the capacity of some capitalists to be more competitive than others and mark up their prices, this depends on their ability to coerce labor either in order to increase working hours or, more significantly, to change the organization of the labor process. In sum, labor does not produce value in itself, but constitutes a central factor in determining the capacity of some capitalists to be more productive than others, and what strategies they pursue. This is why valuation ultimately becomes intricately linked to the question of labor, because it is the struggle over production which becomes the central determinant in the way capitalists fix prices. One of the crucial implications of this discussion is that social transformations and the norms that govern social life became increasingly linked to the question of production with the rise of capitalism. As decisions around such norms thus grew in importance, they only intensified the conflict between capital and labor, which became a dominant axis across which social struggles were waged. Social struggles were then both experienced as an expression of this conflict and conducted along those lines as the nature of class struggle that we associate with capitalism took shape. Conclusion. This article has proposed a historical materialist approach to value theory which seeks to reconcile value theory with the framework of political Marxism. I have argued that value theory has remained at odds with this form of historical materialism because value theory's formal nature and value theory's tendency to rely on abstract logic and an abstract logic that is derived before any historical analysis. This ultimately makes it inflexible for historical inquiry. By contrast, I propose a reading of Marx's theory of value as a tool for specifying the significance of social strategies in a market society. This reading is based on the idea that such a theory is required because of the nature of alienation in market societies, where people are unaware of the social consequences of their actions. In this sense, I see the labor theory of value as a means for problematizing the social significance of market dynamics in capitalism, rather than taking it as a description for how they occur, because these strategies are not predetermined by an overarching logic. This has three important implications for thinking of value theory and determining what is Marx's contribution to this question. First, I insisted that value theory is not an economic method, as value theory is often assumed by Marxist economists. The point is not to develop an alternative accounting procedure on which to base our analysis of history. Rather, value theory provides a basic framework for problematizing how social norms are shaped through market dynamics. Alienation in market economies creates the illusion that markets are determined by purely quantitative factors, such as labor time or prices. For this reason, value theory has, for its purpose, to specify the process of valuation in capitalism that escapes people's consciousness and which relates to the social implications of their economic decisions. No doubt, many Marxists will be disappointed with this somewhat loose theory because it does not formulate a fully fledged mechanism by which value is formed. But this depends on what one expects from theory. It is my belief that theory only represents a means for specifying in a richer way social reality, not a means to abstract from social reality. Theory provides clarity in specifying what needs to be explained, but it cannot serve as a substitute for historical research. This I take to be one of the central contributions of political Marxism and its comparative method geared towards contrasting and enriching our understanding of social trajectories, rather than abstracting ideal types or formal models from them. Second, I have put forth a differential conception of value aimed at examining how certain strategies shape the agency of actors within capitalism. The advantage of this approach is that it recognizes the agency and subjectivity of consumers, workers, and capitalists as an integral feature of valuation. More importantly, it offers a way to explain how people can quote value in terms of labor without being aware of it, as the ability to mark up depends increasingly on the productivity of one's labor process in relation to others. Capitalist social norms systematically gravitate towards new strategies of production. There is a crucial political aspect to this seemingly managerial and economic dynamic of capitalism. As Marx points out, because the struggle between capital and labor is a central aspect of social transformations, in a way that is radically novel. Value is thus related to labor because the reorganization of the labor process, which determines the capacity of capitalists to mark up, is at the heart of capitalist competition. In this way, political struggles between capitalists and workers have become pivotal in the development of new social norms under capitalism. The way this unfolds, however, remains a matter of historical inquiry. Third, I argue that reading value theory in this way fundamentally changes our assessment of political Marxism and political Marxism's supposed neglect of value theory. The importance of Marx's discussion of value theory for historical materialism partly consists in the way value theory highlighted a novel feature of capitalism, i.e., the emphasis on restructuring the labor process as a means to compete for compete for power on markets. This is in itself a considerable achievement and has since been further developed by political Marxists in a more elaborate historical explanation. For critics of the approach, however, the way political Marxists have turned towards history represents a weakness, because it leaves behind the theoretical categories developed by Marx, most notably value. However, this formal attachment to Marx's demonstration in Capital perpetuates a certain reification of value, as if value is a thing that could be measured. Hence, I have argued that the real importance of Marx's discussion of value lies in the way it points to the manner in which capitalism is socially constructed, that is, the social norms that underpin it. For this reason, Marx's demonstration in Capital should be lauded for having explained a fundamental feature of capitalist societies, not for having laid out a form of reasoning that one should reenact every time one wishes to explain something about capitalism. Once this qualitative aspect is specified, further aspects of capitalism need to be addressed, and this requires that we move further in our comparative analysis in order to capture how changes under capitalism are themselves socially constructed in the full sense of the word. For this endeavor, the logic of value depicted in Capital will not suffice, even if the logic of value depicted in Capital offers important clues as to where we need to look. In advancing these propositions, my point is not simply that the labor theory of value can be rendered compatible with political Marxism, in the sense of being better attuned to the problematic of the transition to capitalism, which has loomed large in the writings of this approach. I believe it also offers an interesting means to push political Marxism itself in order to better historicize capitalism. In that sense, an engagement with the problematic of value can be beneficial for political Marxism, which has been less successful in historicizing capitalism than pre-capitalist societies, partly because the comparative work on the various capitalist trajectories remains to be done in this approach. There's been a tendency among political Marxists to rely on an overly structuralist notion of capitalism as a system with inherent dynamics. From Brenner's attempt to construct an ideal type of capitalist rationality, to Ellen Wood's characterization of American imperialism as a pure form of capitalist imperialism, capitalism is too often being presented, even within political Marxism, as being shaped by an overarching logic that is only becoming increasingly prominent with time. Political Marxism now needs to take a step further in applying its own comparative method to the study of capitalism itself in order to historicize capitalism. This requires above all that we stop taking the imperative of the market as the defining feature of capitalism. Social imperatives clearly do matter because they compel social classes to find solutions to distinct types of problems and encourage the diffusion of successful innovations, thus normalizing them. Yet these solutions are not predetermined. It was institutional adaptations to market imperatives in England that created the distinctive leverage used by capitalists to exploit the working class, not the market imperative itself. The institutions that shaped capitalist social relations continue to evolve, and thus capitalism cannot be reduced to its market imperatives, as if it only produced one type of social dynamic. Studying the trajectories of capitalism to grasp capitalism's own historicity and capitalism's qualitatively different forms is the next important task that awaits political Marxism. This is why reflecting on Marx's argument about value can serve a useful purpose, because it brilliantly conceptualizes how people can be the agents of their own history, while still producing unintended effects that become characteristic of capitalism. Thanks for listening, everybody.